Welcome to the Jewish Diasporist, a podcast exploring the political, social, and cultural implications of life in diaspora. We are your hosts, Ben Yanowitz
and Zach. For this episode, Ben informed me that he interviewed Sydney Levy, an organizer involved with JVP, previously as an advocacy director, JSWANA Bay, a group of Southwest Asian and North African Jews in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he is also an occasional contributor to print publications, including Gazoz de Frambuaz, who regular listeners will recall.
Throughout our conversation, Sydney and I spoke about his personal and political journey, moving from the insular Zionist Jewish community he grew up as part of in Venezuela, to his time as an accidental settler in Jerusalem, before moving to New York City as a young adult, and later to Oakland, where he currently resides. Among various topics, Sydney and I explored his recent ancestors and personal experience of immigration and diaspora, along with the political relevance of various identity labels in the project of building a better future. That, and much more, in the interview to come.
Before we get into the conversation, we'd like to remind you that we continue to produce this show because of what we believe it adds to the wider conversation on the Jewish left. If you like what we are doing here, please share this with others who might be interested. And if you aren't already, follow us on Instagram at the Jewish Diasporist Pod, subscribe to our shared YouTube channel, the Hamotzi Network, and consider making a monthly contribution through our Patreon. All of these links are in the description.
This was a conversation that could definitely have a second part. Of the many conversation topics we had planned, we only got to just a fraction. So stay tuned for a potential second part in the future. Highlight, potential. We hope you enjoy this conversation.
We are beautiful people, though our hearts are broken. We sing for justice and wholeness.
Sydney, it's so good to sit down with you. It's been a little bit since we've seen each other. Actually, well, we're recording this the day after Shavuot, and I actually saw you yesterday at Rabbis for a Ceasefire's 24-hour study session where you gave a talk about protective presence, as this is something that you've done several times in Palestine. And it was a really important talk. I thought the way you went into depth on the actual reality of what that looks like and what that feels like, and the complications and the difficulties of doing this in 2026, I think is really important. And I really appreciated the way that you made space for people who are thinking about doing this and people who have done it to really be part of that conversation. I think it was a really important contribution to that broader 24-hour study session. But Sydney, you and I met actually at, were we in, I don't want to call it jail, but were we in police custody?
We were in police custody, yes.
Yeah,
temporarily.
It's a funny way to meet, but we were at a JVP action that was protesting.
We're not going to say who or what at this moment.
I was protesting individuals who are complicit in genocide, and there was, I think it was well over 100 of us who were arrested that day.
Yes,
and
138.
138. That's a lot of people. And it was honestly a blessing to be part of that action with you and to chat a little bit afterwards. You had some interesting perspectives about the concept of diaspora, and I'm really glad to have met with you that day. It was a holy way to meet each other.
Indeed.
So before we go into all the things that you've done and all of your life experience, can you just tell us about growing up where you did and what that was like?
Yeah, so it's a little bit different, not different from me, but from comparing myself to others here. I am a Latino Jew. I was born in Venezuela. My family is not from Latin America. My family is from what is now called the Middle East. We call it these days Southwest Asia, North Africa. So my parents are from Egypt. My grandparents are from the larger Ottoman Empire, from countries that are now Greece, Turkey, and Lebanon. So we always had a very rooted perspective in the Levant, and always a strong sense of being Jewish, extremely Zionist upbringing. So much so that when I was 17 years old, I moved to Jerusalem. I studied Jewish history at the Hebrew University. I became an accidental settler. I was a settler for a good number of years, probably about 7 years, even though I did not know that I was a settler. That was how ignorant you can be inside of your Zionist education. And then I came to this country. Then I came to the United States, and I was first in New York. Now I've been in California. I am married with my husband of 35, going on 36 years.
Yeah. Thank you for that
That's
introduction.
that's on one foot.
Yeah, that's a lot of time you just condensed into a very brief sentences. But you mentioned Venezuela. I'm actually very curious about what it was like growing up as part of the Jewish community in Venezuela, because this is a community I honestly hadn't heard anything about until we first spoke. So what does that actually look like? How many Jews are in Venezuela? What is the kind of character of the community in relation to the wider Venezuelan people?
So I will talk about my time, which was the 1970s, 1980s. The Jewish community in Venezuela changed drastically in the same way that the whole country changed drastically. I was in the pre-Bolivarian Revolution times. Then there was the Bolivarian Revolution. Then there was the Maduro dictatorship that hasn't fully ended, even though Maduro was abducted by the US. So the community in my time, we were about 20 to 30,000 Jews. I believe that now there's about 5,000 Jews left in the country. We were very insular. So when I look at American Jews, Jews from the United States, most of the Jews that I meet in this country are not first generation Jews. Their parents were already born here, maybe even their grandparents. The community where I grew up, we were the first generation. Most of my parents' generation were immigrants, and not only immigrants, but recent immigrants. So I was born when my parents were in the country for 5 years only. So largely, most of the community was like that. Most of the community came a little bit before, during, or a little after World War II. So there was an original older community. I'm not trying to say, there were even Jews from colonial times, but largely the large mass of Jews came relatively recently. So we all had a sense not only of our Jewishness, but of our rootedness in the old country. We all had a sense that there were other languages, that there were other cultures, that there were other places that we were coming from. There was also a very heavy Zionist fervor and Zionist education as well. And there was at the time a very strong separation between us as Jews and the rest of the Venezuelan population. So I was born there. I have Venezuelan citizenship, had it then, Venezuelan passport and everything. But my parents always insisted, you are not Venezuelan, you are Jewish. To the degree that I went to Jewish kindergarten, Jewish primary school, Jewish high school, all of my friends, all of them, except for maybe one or two neighbors in the building, were Jewish. As a matter of fact, I didn't need to interact with anybody that wasn't Jewish. It was a very insular community in ways that, I don't know, they may be replicable maybe in Brooklyn or in some places, but largely that's not the American experience. Also, on the other side of the coin, on the non-Jewish side of the coin, Venezuela was not a country where we lived with hyphenated identities. Like here, you can be Italian American, Irish American, Jewish American, this and the other. There we were just Venezuelan. So this capability of holding two things at the same time was a little bit harder. So I have a name, Sydney, last name Levy. None of them are what you would call Venezuelan names. They're not Latino names. So as soon as I would introduce myself to anybody who was not Jewish in Venezuela, they would ask, where were you born? Because it was inconceivable that somebody with my name would be Venezuelan. And I was like, I was born here. No, really, where are you from? I'm from here. So there was a big gap between the Jewish community and the rest of the country. That gap became less pronounced, and it actually, the Jewish community started blending better, but that was the next generation. I left in 1980. Jews that remained later, my sister and others that remained for longer, then they were more rooted in Venezuela because they had a longer experience there. They had their children there, and their children were no longer children of immigrants, they were grandchildren of immigrants. So there was more of a rooting yourself in the country. I belong to the transitional generation, I believe, which is important when we are thinking about diaspora, because generally, I think when you think of diaspora, I think the main way of thinking of it is diaspora from Israel. It's like the 2,000-year-old diaspora, which is in the Israel national anthem. But actually, there are many diasporas. I can mention in my larger biography, there's that diaspora. There's diaspora from Spain. There's diaspora from Egypt. At this moment, there's diaspora from Venezuela. And there are different relations to all of these places where we come from. And there are different ways of relating to it and also different ideas about whether we should return or not.
Yeah. I mean, I think that framing of diaspora as like there's actually multiple diasporas is why I kind of cringe when I hear people say the diaspora as if there's one diaspora, which is like this. I mean, it almost reminds me of Simon Dubnov, the person from Jewish historian that coined the term diaspora nationalism, where I'm like, okay, are we talking about the very state of dispersal, which is like a universal phenomenon that is not particularly Jewish at all? Or are we talking about some 2,000-year-old diaspora out of whatever you want to call it, Eretz Yisrael, Palestine, where that is something that's not really related to our actual experience as people in the 21st century. But when you break it down to, oh, there's actually multiple diaspora, I think it helps me to understand diasporism, not as diaspora nationalism, but as something that's much more similar to internationalism as a whole. Something that's more similar to like a transnational politics with multi-rootedness, which I think is a term you introduced to me when we met.
Yes, I think
idea of
multi-rootedness. Term. David Nahar, who's a professor in Seattle, taught me, he created the term, I believe, or he uses it. I learned it from him, this concept of multi-rootedness. I was very much opposed to the concept of diaspora originally for another reason, because so I think in different languages at the same time, and I was translating diaspora in Hebrew. In Hebrew, the real translation of the word diaspora is tfutsa. Tfutsa or tfutsot is plural, which means
I actually didn't realize there was a translation other than galut, which is a much more ideological term.
Yes, so I'm going to go into that now. If you go are in Tel Aviv, there's this big museum called Beit Atfutsot. It's the house of the diasporas. And so the idea is a very Zionist idea, of course. It shows these are the diasporas. These are all of the different places where Jews, were dispersed. And now here we are back, in the Holy Land. But the term is Bet Atfutsot. Tfutsa means dispersion. Diaspora means dispersion. Now, largely in Hebrew, people translate diaspora as galut or golah.
Which, for those who don't know, is exile.
Which is exile. Now, galut or golah really has the connotation of we are out of the center and we need to we will return to the center. To me, galut is like the Babylonian exile, is by the rivers of Babylon where we sat down and we remember Zion. That's galut. Those are people that were sitting by the river trying to go back, which is kind of like ironic because if you think about it, even though we talk about the Babylonian exile, and I just mentioned the song By the Rivers of Babylon, when Jews were allowed to return, most did not. Most Jews remained in Babylon, and good for them, because if it wasn't for the Jews that stayed there, we wouldn't have the Babylonian Talmud. So even then, even the concept of exile in its most pure form, which is the Babylonian exile, didn't fully end in a full return. Few Jews returned to the land of Israel. Most remained in Babylon. So that was one of my issues with the concept of diaspora, is that I would associate it with exile. And the way that I see diaspora now is dispersion. But when you think about dispersion, if you think about almost like the Big Bang, dispersion means that there is a center, and then there's dispersion. But there is still a sense that there was a center before. You need to disperse from some place. Whereas at this moment, when we talk about multiple diasporas and this concept of multi-rootedness, there is not a single center. So yeah, we can say there was a center and then there was a dispersion, and then from that dispersion there were other dispersions. So you can think of it more of as a network of like different circles that have different arrows, and then other circles and more arrows, and it becomes fairly complicated. And that's the beauty of it. Just to give you an example, my family is from Egypt. My parents were born in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
There was an Ashkenazi synagogue in Egypt.
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, actually, calling it a synagogue is too much. They had a minyan. They had a minyan for the high holidays. They rented place inside of another institution, so they would have their high services. But I have an aunt, well, may she rest in peace, whose family was from Russia and immigrated to Egypt, and so she was as comfortable thinking about the Yiddish Mame as she was belly dancing. And she spoke Arabic, but she also knew Yiddish. And interestingly enough, so we don't think about these things. About for her in Egypt, Russia was a diaspora. She was in diaspora in relation to Russia, right? In relation to Eastern Europe. But when she moved to Venezuela, she was very much, she would cook all of the Middle Eastern food. She loved, she was a Middle Eastern Jew at the same time as she spoke Yiddish with her mother. So things get a little bit more complicated. As a matter of fact, if you find a Jew whose last name is Ashkenazi, and I know some, I can guarantee you that they come from a Sephardic country. And they are called Ashkenazi because the moment that they immigrated to a place where Sephardic Jews were the majority, that's how they were recognized. Oh, here's the Ashkenazi. And that became their name. I mean, there's no point of calling yourself Ashkenazi in Ashkenaz.
No. That's actually, I think, so illuminating of the way that you can literally live through multiple diasporas yourself. And then when you're actually, by doing that process of whether you want to call it immigration or movement or exile, whatever language you want to use, like, I'm curious how it impacted. This was your mother you were talking about?
This person was my aunt.
Your aunt. I'm curious how then coming to Venezuela, how they would think about that in terms of like, oh, I have ancestry from Russia, I have ancestry from Egypt, and now I'm in Venezuela. Are these things mixing?
Yeah.
Are these things kind of staying separated?
Venezuela was always separate for the reason that I told you, that we kept some distance. We always, this is metaphorical, but at the time, I always felt that we were living in Venezuela with our suitcases by the side, just in case we needed to leave, because my parents were immigrants, and I think it was still the trauma, not only of the Holocaust that I wasn't alive then, but my family experienced with certain closeness. Most of my family was not in Europe, but we lost a chunk of family in Greece. Also, people think that just because you're in the Middle East, you had no connection to Nazi Germany, but you gotta remain. My parents were in Egypt. The Germans were stopped in El Alamein. They were stopped just a few hours from Alexandria. Alexandria was a port city, it was under German bombardment. So was Tel Aviv and Haifa. There were German planes flying over at some point. And the Jewish inhabitants of mandatory Palestine were afraid of what happens if Germany invades. So the Holocaust had obviously implications all over the Jewish world. Leaving Egypt had its own implications as well. It was not fun. My parents left with different statuses. My mother was born in Egypt, but she never had the Egyptian nationality. We are used to thinking today that because you're born in a particular country, you immediately acquire that nationality. If you're born in the U.S., you're a U.S. citizen, even though Trump now wants to abolish citizenship by birth. My mother was born in Egypt, but her parents never registered her as Egyptian. So she wasn't. So she didn't have Egyptian nationality. They should have registered her in the Greek consulate because my grandparents were Greek, but they didn't register her in the Greek consulate either, because they saw war coming, and they didn't want. My grandparents didn't want their children to be enlisted in the Greek army. So they just had no nationality, and didn't need a nationality because you weren't traveling. You needed a nationality if you wanted to have a passport, but they didn't travel. So the first time that they needed a passport was when my mother left the country. She didn't have a nationality, so she had what in diplomatic terms is called a laissez-passer, let me pass. It's a diplomatic paper, and her nationality was apatride, which means in French, without a homeland.
Okay, dang.
That's it.
But they did have a homeland, or they had many homelands.
But non-officially.
Non-officially.
My father had an Egyptian nationality, which he had to give up. So he also left.
Why did he have to give it up?
That was one of the conditions of living. I mean, basically, the story of Jews living in Middle Eastern countries is very complicated because each country has a different story. And inside of each country, different departures, different Jews left for different reasons. There is a movement now to try to explain the migration of Jews from Arab lands as a full-on expulsion. And that movement tries to make an equivalent, saying all of these Jews were expelled from the Middle East, and then all of these Palestinians were expelled from Palestine. So there's a population exchange.
That makes it all okay.
First of all, there is no population exchange. Secondly, even if there was a population exchange, Palestinians should not be paying the price for what happened in Egypt, Iraq, Morocco, Lebanon, Syria, or other places. And thirdly, and as importantly, I mean, saying paying the price, I explain this to people from Latin America, and we understand it very well. When I say Palestinians shouldn't be paying the price, I tell people, well, if something happened to the Jews in Argentina, what is Venezuela responsible for that? Or what is Nicaragua responsible for? Yeah, we're all Latin Americans, but we're different countries. Like, the Arab world, these are different countries. They're not just, because we're all Arabs, we're all just one nation. But more importantly, just for 1 second, is that not all of the Jews were expelled. Some people left because they wanted to leave. Some people left because they had no option. Some people left their countries simply because Zionists were putting bombs in synagogues.
Yeah, I mean, we have the Lavon affair, we have the Baghdad bombings,
which I didn't believe. When I was growing up, I didn't believe that this was possible. I didn't believe that Jews could do this. I didn't believe that Jews could do the Nakba. I was so imbued, not only on Zionist propaganda, but on the sense that Jews had this higher morality, abnormally high morality, which is not true for any people, that it was just hard for me to swallow all of that.
Yeah. I mean, I do want to come back to this of how you unlearned that and the process of that. But before we get to that, earlier you mentioned that your upbringing included a lot of Zionism, and I don't know if this was just from the community or also within your family. But that does make me really wonder what led them to Venezuela in particular. Because if I'm doing the math right, it sounds like your family came to Venezuela in the mid-'60s, which means...
In 58.
In 58, well, even then, it makes me wonder, couldn't they theoretically have just gone to Palestine and settled there? And it reminds me of quotes of it reminds me of a story I read of a Zionist activist from before the state was founded, whose son was also a Zionist activist, and his son tells the dad, "Oh, I'm going to go to Palestine." And he's like, no, you have to stay here with me. And it's the point being that actually Zionism for a lot of people is the right for other Jews to go to Palestine, not for themselves. And I'm curious, is that how it was? What about Venezuela was particularly pulling them there?
So let's put Venezuela aside for a second. I'm going to get there. But Palestine, or at that moment it was the state of Israel already, was for poor Jews. The concept that was a place of refuge, right? And literally, for the longest time, I would hear this story like saying, like Moroccan Jews, once I could afford it, moved to Latin America, moved to France, moved to Canada. Those that couldn't afford it, they moved to Israel, which is very classist. It's probably not even true, but that concept that the worst, quote unquote, the worst of are the ones that we send to Israel. We allow to go there, whatever, serves both a purpose of making the Jews that did not go there feel better, but also serves a purpose, frankly, even though it's not formulated in this way, to say, yeah, maybe Ashkenazim in Israel are a little bit right when they complain about the Mizrahim, because they got the worst of the worst. We, the ones that went to other countries, we are better. We have a better social class. We have more education. We're better off. Those, the Moroccans, the Egyptians, those that went there,
I
they're
guess that makes sense if you think about the conditions most of these Jews that were going to Palestine or the state of Israel were going into. Because I remember from my days taking a Hebrew class of the term ma'abarot, the transit camps that were basically, you'd have the Ashkenazi immigrants come and they'd get in these nice, fancy, air-conditioned. I might be off base there, but the Ashkenazi immigrants would be coming into apartments as you might expect, and then the Sephardim, Musa Arabim, different Jews that were not white would be ending up going to camps that were basically not totally dissimilar from the way that Palestinian refugees were living.
Well, put out the air conditioning, because I don't think that anybody had air conditioning. But just to be clear, I believe that even inside of Ashkenazim, there was a gradation of who is a better Ashkenazi and who is worse. Probably, I'm guessing that the Romanians were at the bottom of the Ashkenazi world. But my uncle, who was in a Ma'abara from Egypt, he migrated to Israel. He actually didn't so much migrate to Israel as he was exchanged, because he was caught in Egypt as being a Zionist. And in 1947, 48, 49, that around the time of the Nakba and the creation of the state of Israel, he was imprisoned as a traitor in Egypt. And he stayed in prison in Egypt as a Zionist. And then he was part of at the armistice, he was part of the prisoner exchange, even though he was not an Israeli soldier or, part of the Palmach or the Haganah or whatever. He was exchanged. So he was let out of prison under the condition that he does not go back to Egypt. So he was just sent to Israel. And he was in a Ma'abara, and one of the stories that he would say is that he remembers how there were Ashkenazim in the Ma'abarot as well, just to be clear. I mean, there was not enough housing. But the Jewish agency would come at night, pick up the Ashkenazim little by little and take them out. Why at night? Because they didn't want the Sephardic Jews to rebel. So all of a sudden you will wake up in the morning and you will go like, oh, what happened to? Oh, yeah, they're gone. Yeah, because they would get, earlier housing. But I don't doubt that there were Ashkenazim in Ma'abarot also for months at a time. Only for people like my family, it was for years at a time. Now, this story about where to go, just to give you a very concrete example, when my mother left Egypt, she was already married to my father. She had her own parents who were old. So my mother is an immigrant. She doesn't know, how she's going to be able to sustain herself. So what does she do? They take a boat from Egypt. They travel to Europe. They immediately drop her parents to be sent to Israel. This is not Zionism. This is basically, we cannot take care of you at this moment. You have a son already in Israel. So the Jewish agency will take care of you up until we can take care of you. And that's what ended up happening. Basically, they were sent to Israel when my parents moved to Venezuela. A number of years later, when they were better off, they went to Israel and they brought them to Venezuela. But it was like a placeholder. This is where poor Jews go. This is where Jews that don't have resources go. Why Venezuela? Because there were not very many countries at the time that accepted Jews without passports, or anyone without a passport. My parents didn't have a passport. So they were looking at Venezuela, they were looking at Brazil as countries that were open for immigration. The US was not one of those countries. And they ended up in Venezuela. And, typical immigrant story. Somebody that was a relative of a relative said, this is a good country. There's oil. The economy is going to be good. And it was true.
Yeah.
So they went there without knowing much, and they made a living.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing all of that. I think that story is so telling, this kind of way that, to a certain extent, people still talk about Israel as if it's some kind of like insurance policy for Jewish people, but at that time, like, it kind of was, because as you were saying, most of the world had shut doors to immigrants in general, as we're seeing today, but to passportless, stateless people in particular. And that did play that role. It's interesting to hear that they stayed there and then came to Venezuela when the time came right. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, there is a difference between having a place of refuge and having an ethno-state, to be clear. And
yes.
And there is a difference between having a country, that's at this moment is Israel, that constitutes itself as an ingathering of refugees, while at the same time, that same country is denying not only the right of return of Palestinians who are indigenous to the land, but actually Israel has horrible, horrible asylum laws for people who are not Jewish. We used to work with these friends of mine that were part of the original Jews of Color Sephardic Mizrahi Caucus of JVP like 10, 15 years ago, regarding Africans who were not Jewish, who migrated to Israel seeking refuge, and Israel having as part of its DNA, we are a country of refugees. We're coming after the Holocaust. We understand, persecution. They were terrible, terrible with African refugees. Terrible. And so this was a case of people who were not Palestinian. So you could not say, well, because they're Palestinians, you have this like national fight. They're the indigenous population that you're trying to ethnically cleanse or genocide. These were just, a number of thousands of African refugees. They were not going to take over the country. And yes, it was very hard. It was very hard because the concept of ingathering of refugees only applies to Jews. And that is the meaning of having an ethno-state, is that everything only applies to Jews. There's a rule and a law for Jews, and there's a rule and a law for non-Jews. That's what we call apartheid. That's what we have there.
Yeah, you're 100% right. I think it's important to make that distinction. So thank you for saying that. I am curious because you mentioned that you became an accidental settler for a number of years when you went to Jerusalem. I'm curious, what was the process of your politicization? Did this happen while you were in Jerusalem? Did this happen after? I'm just curious because obviously you've moved a lot politically since then. I'm curious, are there any moments that informed your current worldview that happened I'm just curious about the trajectory of how you got from there to where you are today.
Yeah, so I was the most Zionist person that you can imagine. But again, and this shows you, you were talking before about the child that tells, his or her father, I'm going to move to Israel. And the father goes like, no, don't leave me. I was 17 years old, and I told my parents, I'm going to Jerusalem to study Jewish history at the Hebrew University, which is what I did. And my parents had two questions from me, and both were with horror. You're not going to become a rabbi, are you? And I said, no, this is secular, this is Jewish history. You're not going to make Aliyah, are you? And I go like, no, I'm just going there to study. And here you have a family that was so proud in its Jewishness, so proud of its Zionist identity, but not their son. So yeah, it was very, and partially the issue of not becoming an Israeli, I think was connected, they didn't want me geographically apart from them, but they also were afraid of the army, of me having to go to the army. That's for other people to do. That's not for their son. So I moved to Jerusalem as a student with us. I didn't even have a student visa. The system in Israel at the time, I'm sure it has changed tremendously, but at the time, it was complicated for a Jew to be there and not make Aliyah. Now, if you're in this country, like as an American, when I came to this country, it's very difficult to get a visa to come to the US. If you get a visa, it's very difficult to convert that non-immigrant visa into a green card. Once you have a green card, you are a permanent resident. You're an immigrant. You're not a US citizen. You cannot vote, but you can be here for many years as a green card holder. It's only now in the Trump years that we have seen people with green cards being deported. But largely, you had some sense of safety traditionally as a green card holder, and nobody forced you to become a US citizen. You could decide after 5 years or 3 if it was by marriage, if you wanted to become a US citizen or not. But if not, you just were a green card holder. In Israel, the system works exactly the opposite. If you're Jewish, you have no problem getting a visa. You're Jewish. But the moment that you enter Israel, as a Jew, you are expected to not just have a temporary visa, you are expected to have the equivalent of a green card, which is called Toshav Arai. And if you get there, if you have a green card, 3 years later, whether you want it or not, you become an Israeli citizen. You don't have to ask. You become. Why? Because you're Jewish. So they kind of suck you in.
Did that mean that you became an Israeli citizen?
No.
No, you had to prevent that from happening somehow.
And that was a lot of work. That was heavy work. So this is separate from my process of ideological deconversion from Zionism. This is more like the legal part. The legal part basically meant that every year, because I was studying at the university and there was no student visa, so every year I went to the Israeli consulate in Venezuela and I asked for a tourist visa. There was a 3-month visa. So I got it. And I went to Jerusalem, and it was let's say September, or August, September, October, by the high holidays. That's when the classes started, immediately after the high holidays. But I had only 3 months. So then I would go to the Minister of the Interior, and I would say, hey, I'm a student. I need you to extend this tourist visa until the summer because I'm studying. And they will give me an extension. The summer, I will go back to Venezuela. My visa had expired. I will get a new tourist visa. I will go back in September. And then I will go back to the Minister of the Interior, ask for another extension. I did that for 7 years.
Wow.
So I was a tourist for 7 years. Now, they were not happy with this. You have to remember that this was a time before the internet, before things were so interconnected. So what ended up happening is that the first number of years, I did this at the Minister of the Interior in Jerusalem. By year 3 or something, they were like, we know you. You're coming every year as a tourist, and you ask for an extension. You cannot do that. You have to have your Toshav Araut. You have to be a green card holder, which is an automatic pathway to become an Israeli citizen. You have to. You cannot keep on doing this. So I took the bus and went to Tel Aviv. I went to the Minister of the Interior of Tel Aviv, but they didn't know me there. And as I said, the systems were not as connected as they are now. So yeah, I managed to play this bureaucratic game for 7 years up until I left the country. So I never became an Israeli citizen. You are not going to find very many Jews that can live in Israel without becoming Israeli. It's almost impossible. The system catches you in.
It's interesting. I didn't realize just how different that is from the United States, with the immigration, particularly for Jews. I mean, it does kind of say a little bit about the ethnic character of the state when this is only for Jews that this is obviously applying.
Yeah, it's not only that it applies only for Jews, which it does, obviously, but Israel has always been in a demographic battle with Palestinians, hence the Nakba, hence what's happening in Gaza, hence what we see in the West Bank every day. So there's always this paranoia that do we have enough Jews in here to be a majority? And really, between the river and the sea, you could say, give or take, that it's 50-50. Right? If you count everybody, now not everybody gets to vote because not everybody is an Israeli citizen. There's a lot of people that live under occupation and all of that. So Israel is always looking. Why do you think that Israel is now going to India or to other places to see, oh, yeah, we found this small Jewish community and we want to bring them in? It's not so much that they want to bring 5,000 Jews from India or from wherever they find them. It's that they are really desperate to get more Jews. Now, they would love to get American Jews, to come in large numbers. That is not happening. Obviously, there are some that come. Most of them are settlers, the American Jews that go there. But really, the large reservoirs of Judaism are where? Are in some places in the United States, in Canada, some places in Europe, Latin America, South Africa. Most of these Jews are not moving to Israel. So there's always this paranoia about the demographic battle. This paranoia, which is very Zionist, which basically the logical conclusion of it is ethnic cleansing and genocide. It's a paranoia that I also saw in J Street, by the way. I went to the first J Street conference.
What year was that?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but I'm going to say after 2010. I'm going to say between 2010 and 2015. I'm guessing. I went to the first conference, and I remember very well this, they had like a big speech, and they also had workshops. And I went to a workshop that was about communication, how to communicate the message of what JC wanted to communicate at the time, right? And I went to that particular workshop because I was interested by the fact that the person that was leading the workshop was a demographer. And I was like, what does a demographer has to do with talking about peace in the Middle East and justice in the Middle East and all of that stuff? So here we are in a small room, and the demographer really shamelessly, I was so embarrassed for this person, shamelessly said, I have good news and bad news for you. The good news is that the Arabs who are citizens of Israel, I don't think he would call them Palestinians, but the Arab citizens of Israel, their economic level is rising. And as it is rising, they're having fewer children. So their families are not reproducing as fast. Now, Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, they have lots of children. So the good news is that the Arab citizens of Israel, their rate of multiplication rate, whatever, there is slowing down. The other piece of good news is if we now pay attention, this person was talking to American Jews, not to Israelis, but use the word we. If we give up the West Bank and Gaza, we meaning Zionists or American Jews, even though American Jews, we don't own any of this land, right? If we give it up, then we are going to be able to preserve a Jewish majority state inside of Israel by letting go of that other place, the West Bank and Gaza, that is full of Palestinians. So it was all a demographic argument. The reason to give up these territories, that we, American Jews, together with Israelis, are going to give up these territories, is to preserve the demographic majority. I remember raising up my hand, and I was probably one of the first person to speak in the question and answer period. And I said, look, I'm coming from California at this moment. And if there was a demographer that would stand up and say, I have good news and bad news, Latinos are reproducing too fast, but maybe not fast enough. The good news is that if we bring more white people, then there's going to be fewer Latinos, or there's too many Latinos. If we give up part of it to Mexico, all of these calculations are racist.
Yeah.
If anybody would say this about California, I would call it racist. And that's what you guys are doing. Zero answer, zero response.
I mean, he just kind of broke his entire point to make the point of, oh, you're supporting a two-state solution to preserve your ethno-state.
Yeah.
Like, that sounds like it doesn't actually care about Palestinians at all.
Correct.
It's actually only giving up the West Bank and Gaza so that they don't dilute the Jewish character of the state, which is horrifying that that would be said in an ostensibly center-left organization like J Street.
Well, but that's where I see liberals, and I was there, just to be clear, not at that time I had evolved, but I went through my J Street period way before J Street was created. So I had to do my evolution. I was a Zionist. I had to become a liberal Zionist. I had to become a 1967. Let's give up 1967, but not 1948. I went through all of those evolutions. I was a Nakba denier. I was a right of return denier. Like Palestinians don't have the right to return. Then I went to a point where, yeah, they have a right to return, but I hope that they don't do it because I'm concerned about the demographics. I did the whole evolution, all of it, right? And it took a long time. And frankly, it's embarrassing that it took such a long time, but here I am. And
Were there any initial moments while you were still in that phase of being a unknowing settler that like kind of cued you off that there was something wrong there?
yeah, so the annoying settler, this is how racism plays into, like when we talk in this country about living in the wrong side of the tracks, of the, of town or whatever. So I lived in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is a mixed city, and it's also a divided city. Part of it is occupied um, since the '67 war, right? So in my mind, so when you walk in Jerusalem, no place where you find signs that say this is where the Green Line was, this is West Jerusalem, this is, you need to know. Correct. It's a unified capital of the Kingdom of David, blah, blah, blah. So because there were no markers on the ground, in my mind, I made what I now define as racist markers. Basically, I didn't see it in those terms then, but now I see it that way. Any neighborhood where Jews live, I will call West Jerusalem. Any neighborhood where Palestinians live, I will call East Jerusalem. This has nothing to do with the map. It has to do with racism. So I happened to live in a neighborhood that was a Jewish neighborhood in East Jerusalem. But because it was Jewish, I thought it was West Jerusalem. Now, West and East had nothing to do with borders. It had nothing to do with geography of what is west of east of the Green Line. It had to do with who lives there. It was a total demographic racist characterization. That's why I said that I was an accidental settler, because I didn't think of myself as a settler. I thought that I was in West Jerusalem. But that is the privilege when you are in the ruling class, and as a Jew, if whether you want it or not, you have the privilege of being in the ruling class because you live in a Jewish supremacy state. You have the privilege of ignorance. You have the privilege of not knowing because you have the privilege. You don't have to know things. You just are there. You enjoy the privileges. I remember my first year at the Hebrew University, my first 2 years I lived in the dormitories in Mount Scopus. Again, this is another point of privilege. These things are hard to understand up until you sit down and think about them and somebody explains them to you. The dorms, each floor had 10 rooms, and there were 2 students per room, so there were 20 students per floor. And they were separated by gender, so they were like, boys dorms and girls dorms, whatever. But in each floor, there were 20 students. Each floor had an Arab room and 9 rooms that were not Arab. So each floor had, I saw it. I mean, it was quote unquote coincidence that each floor had 18 students that were not Arab, mostly were Jews, 99%, and 2 that were Arabs, probably Palestinian citizens of Israel. Why?
Segregation?
It made no sense.
Yeah.
It was later explained to me how it made a lot of sense, because the way you can isolate the Palestinians. You don't want to have too many Palestinians in one place, but if you have only 2 of them per floor, then they will always feel like they are a minority. They will always know their place. That's what it was at the end of the day. Now, we share bathrooms and we share kitchens because the rooms were just rooms, but the floor had a common bathroom and a common kitchen. So my first encounter with Palestinians, at the time I called them Arabs. That's how I heard them. Not them, but that's how the Israelis would talk about them. They were Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? My encounter with them was in the kitchen. Every time that I went to get a glass of water, they were always in the kitchen. And I think to this day, that it was a matter of economics, that it was cheaper to cook in the kitchen than eating outside. And so they were, they were always cooking in the kitchen from what I can remember. And I didn't know how to cook for, to save my life. But all of this to say is that this is where I met them. And here I am, 2 months or 3 months in the country. So I'm really, really new. I have a tourist visa, so I don't have any status in the country. I have rusty Hebrew. I am speaking with them in Hebrew. They live there. They have Israeli citizenship. And here I am, pulling up a map on the table and started to negotiate with them, saying, this is my land, but I'm going to give you this part. I was like making freaking peace agreements with. This is the level of ignorance and arrogance.
Wow.
Something that is not mine, that I have no legal status to, that I don't even have the full language because my Hebrew was rusty, let alone I didn't speak any Arabic, right? I am negotiating. This is the privilege of the colonizer.
How is that received by the Palestinian students you were talking to?
I don't know. So, I mean, I know what I experienced then, but what I'm telling you is that I had so much ignorance that I experienced lots of generosity from their part. I experienced that they were willing to explain things to me. Now, what they were saying behind my back, hopefully they were cursing me. They were saying, like, what an idiot, this person is. Like, I cannot believe that this is happening. But they were not saying that in front of me, right? That was the beginning of my political education. And really, that's the level of ignorance with which I came. And it was not their job to educate me. It was their job to say, screw you, like, get the hell out of my face. But that's not what they did. And I'm eternally grateful that they did educate me. But I'm embarrassed to tell this story because that shows you the level of ignorance and the level of racism from which I came, that I had to overcome. I'm proud that I overcame it, but it also took me a long time. It was not a 1 or 2 day process to move from that moment. That was 1980, 81. By 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. And that year was the Sabra and Shatila massacre. That was a horrible massacre. And there were many other things that were happening. So Sabra and Shatila is what I think we remember the most. But there was violence against Palestinians in Lebanon, against Lebanese all over the place. So 2 things became clear to me. Number one, that Israel needed to get out of Lebanon. How I came to that conclusion, it's funny because it was in my head, it was connected to what I had seen as a kid growing up in Venezuela watching Hollywood movies. I had watched so many Hollywood movies. Those were the 1970s. Now I'm in the 1980s, but growing up in the 1970s, there were so many Hollywood movies about the Vietnam War, about the US get out of Vietnam. So for me, getting Israel out of Lebanon was like getting the US out of Vietnam. I made the exact same parallel. This is wrong, that is wrong. This needs to change, that needs to change. And I used to say openly, I need Israel out of Lebanon because that is wrong. But talking about Palestine and Palestinians, that's more difficult. I would call Palestinians and Israelis like twin brothers, like Siamese brothers, that in order to disconnect one from the other, some pain needed to happen. And since I didn't want to see Israeli Jews incur any pain, I had the privilege to say, I don't want to talk about this now. Again, it's the privilege of the people in power, right? So my first focus of activism really was Lebanon.
Yeah, it's from what I've read, that seems pretty common for people that were politicized in that generation. I read a book by Avram Berg called In Days to Come, and that's the exact experience that ended up having him pulled into politics, him being the son of Yosef Berg, who was one of the founders of the National Religious Party, and he didn't want anything to do with it. And then he was this Zionist aristocracy child, or he was adult at that point, and he was speaking out, and the media was like, oh shoot, we got to get this guy in, and the Labor Party sucked him in and then ended up spitting him out the other end 20 years later. But yeah, it sounds like it makes a lot of sense that Lebanon wouldn't necessarily mean that you're fully comfortable talking about the future of Palestine, because in a real way, that could be understood as a foreign policy position rather than a domestic policy thing. Even when, as we know, this is deeply, deeply intertwined, because they were still going after killing Palestinians up there anyways. It was still part of the same thing anyways, but that doesn't mean that's how it was seen.
But at the time, I didn't agree with the right of return. I didn't believe that the Nakba happened. I still believed all of the stories that the Palestinians left voluntarily. Like, I just couldn't conceive that Jews, being such a moral people, could do all of these things. It was just out of my frame of reference. So yeah. There was a lot to unlearn.
I wish what you just said wasn't so freaking relevant in 2026 in terms of thinking about we need to have Israel out of Lebanon. It seems like literally the state learned nothing from 40 years of failed military adventurism, but I guess that's kind of the point.
No, actually, history repeats itself, but it's not the same. So that time in Lebanon, that invasion in Lebanon, I believe, is the one that created what became known as the Dahia Doctrine. The Dahia is a neighborhood in southern Beirut that was totally obliterated. The Dahia Doctrine, which is like cause as much civilian damage infrastructure and kill as many civilians as possible as a deterrence, was not a made-up thing. It was an official Israeli army doctrine that was first implemented in southern Lebanon, and then it went crazy in Gaza. And now, having learned from the genocide in Gaza, Israel is back in Lebanon, back in Dahia, literally re-implementing the Dahia 2.0, because it's the original Dahia plus the lessons from the Gaza genocide. So it's a Dahia on steroids. So history repeats itself, but it's not exactly the same. It's almost like, if you think about a repetition, you think about a circle going like this, going in circles. It's not a circle, it's a spiral.
I think what you just said about the Dahia Doctrine, which is, I believe, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, correct?
And civilian infrastructure, as punishment, as collective punishment to deter political or military activism. Yeah.
Wow. And of course, Hezbollah was created in response to this invasion, and seems like they've learned nothing. I do want to move us, because we've been talking for close to an hour now. I do want to turn us towards the latter part of your life, which is to say, ever since you left Jerusalem at the time. And we chatted in the past. You've made the point that, actually we were talking about this earlier, that when you grew up, there wasn't hyphenated identities. You were either Venezuelan or Jewish or Israeli or whatever. But I believe you've told me that that changed when you came to the United States. I'm curious how that impacted the way that you understand the political significance of these identities, of whether, I'm curious, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I became a person of color in the U.S. I became a Latino. When I was in Venezuela, I was Venezuelan. When I moved to Jerusalem, I was Latin American. I met other Jews from Argentina, from Mexico, from Peru. So we had this common Latin American bond. We were all Jews, but we had this Latin American sense. But when I came to this country, I stopped being Latin American and I became a Latino. Now it's Latinx, Latine. But I also became a person of color, because this that you see here in Venezuela is white, but here it's not white. So it was a shocker to me, not a bad shocker, not that I was offended or upset. I just didn't know. Like, you look at yourself in the mirror and you give yourself labels according to what you see. And all of a sudden, I understood that people were seeing me differently. They were seeing me as a Latino and as a person of color. I was like, okay, that's fine. That's who I am. But that's what was being reflected my way. Something else happened, which is that in Venezuela, Sephardic Jews, we were 50% of the community. In Israel, Sephardic Jews at the time were 50, if not more. all of a sudden coming here to the United States, Sephardic Jews are a tiny number of the American Jewish community. And all of a sudden I became not only a Latino, but I became a Jewish person of color in the sense of the Jewish community. And that was interesting. Now, it's not, obviously, there's a lot of racism, intra-Jewish racism in Israel, against Mizrahim and all of that. We talked a little bit about the Ma'abarot. That's still, Israel was there, it manifests in different ways. But I was relatively immune to it, because when I was there, when I was living in Jerusalem, my main identity was not my family is from Egypt, is I am from Venezuela. So my main identity was as a Latin American Jew, not as a Jew from the Middle East. So I had a different frame of reference. But when I came to this country and then I started meeting Jews here in the United States, they were so curious in a diversity and inclusion way. Like, oh, so how do you celebrate Passover? What do you do for Shavuot? And I found it extremely funny that it was similar to, they would ask oh, so you're Latino, so how do you say this in Spanish? And what about your accent? And they would ask me things that kind of like made no sense to me, like, how do you celebrate Shavuot? And I was like, we don't. We never did Shavuot in Venezuela. We did Passover, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur, and Hanukkah. Mm-hmm. That's what we did. Mm-hmm.
Now, I'd say many American Jews are the same way.
But they expected me to have all of these stories about, not about being a Latino Jew, but about being a Mizrahi Jew. And by the way, I no longer, I am very careful when I use the word Mizrahi, because I think that Mizrahi should be used in the context of Israel, not in the context of Jews like me that were not socialized in Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you caught, I actually mentioned, I used the term Musta Arabi, which is an older term to describe Arab Jews from further back. And I think that raising the term Mizrahi as like a Israel-specific term is probably right, because as far as I understand, Mizrahi is largely it means Eastern. It's a generalizing term that says that all of these are not Sephardi or Ashkenazi and from this broad Eastern. And actually, I want to use this to transition, because the way you were just talking about your experience as I became a person of color in the US makes me wonder, would you say that these, I don't know if maybe it's different for different types, whether we're talking about ethnicity or culture or nation or whatever, but would you say that these are entirely dependent on the place one is?
Oh, yeah. I mean, race is totally culturally, socially and culturally dependent, 100%. I mean, like, race is a social construct. Like, my skin is not. My skin is a biological construct. But obviously, right, my hair color and my eyes, all of those are biological. But race is a social construct. Oh, yeah, 100%. So, and that's what happens. That's how you can switch code. I would still be white in Venezuela. If I were to return today, this is still white there. Now, I wouldn't be a Venezuelan anymore. I would be a gringo if I were to go back, because I haven't been there.
When's the last time you were in Venezuela?
Almost 20 plus years ago.
So you haven't been back since Hugo Chavez?
No, I was there for the World Social Forum. Chavez was president, and that was in the early 2000s.
Okay, that's very interesting. Honestly, I'm thinking maybe we should wrap up soon, and I'm curious if you're interested. I'd love to do another part on this, because there's so much that we haven't had a chance to go into, and I'm realizing we're not going to get it unless we sit for another 3 hours, and I don't want to take your Shabbos from you or your Shabbat from you. But to wrap us up then, I kind of want to go back deeper onto that question, and I'm not even sure it's necessarily a good question, but this question of identity and like people use the term identity politics all the time, and it's something that like is often used to be like, oh, I don't want to be raising up identity politics because I want to be talking about material politics, or people use it in colloquial terms to be like, this is a bad thing. I'm curious, as someone that has I've said that you have some of the most diverse Jewish ancestry, because we haven't named it, but you have Jewish ancestry that are Sephardi, Musta Arabi, Romaniot, which is the pre-Sephardi Greek Jewish ancestry. And I'd say that that is like something that a lot of people don't think about. It's like you're Jewish and that's it. But when we are talking about it from a perspective of diasporism and thinking about the way that these identities inform our cultural politics in all these different ways, I guess I'm wondering, and this doesn't even have to be just Jewish because you're also a queer person, myself as well, what would you say is the political significance of identity beyond just as like, oh, identity politics are bad, but is there something useful about the politics of identity when it comes to social transformation, when it comes to revolutionary or socialist or left-wing politics? Is there something that is worth engaging with, or is this something that we should just kind of move past?
And but we have to be careful. But of course there is. First of all, we do a lot of privilege analysis, and privilege analysis is not based on, like identity sounds like you have a single identity. And when we're talking about intersectionality, it's the intersection of identities that determine where do you have privilege, where don't you have privilege, how do you maneuver, how do you move in these different spaces according to the privilege that you can deploy to be in solidarity with other people, or the privilege that you lack that you are trying to gain from other people. So, but that's more about intersectionality. When identity in singular as opposed to identities, that's a problem. But when we talk about identities, about an intersectional analysis, I think there's a lot to it. And not only for the political analysis, but also to understand that we come from some place and we are rooted in some place. So when I try to figure out where do I want to go politically, where do I want to go emotionally, where do I want to go in my biography, I want to have some continuation of where do I come from. So I root myself in my culture, in my social environment, and then I expand from it. Basically, I'm not Irish, even though it would be great if I were, but that's not me. I'm not Italian. Actually, I corrected myself. My genetic analysis had me as being 30% Italian.
Was this like a DNA test type thing?
Yeah. If you look at the DNA test, and this is a separate story, this is more genetics, most Ashkenazi Jews will have a genetic marker for Ashkenaziyut. There is no genetic marker for being a Sephardic Jew. So if you're a Sephardic Jew, you are going to appear as being Italian or Greek or Spanish or Levantine. So like basically there is no marker. We're much more diverse and much more diluted. So I have Italian, I have Spanish, I have Greek, I have Turkish in my genetics. I think so identity is where I come from. And the same way that now when I'm doing my Palestine solidarity work, I'm doing it from the point of view of Jewish identity, my different Jewish identities. Why? Because that's where I have my privilege that I'm trying to deploy. But that's also the culture and the social media from where I come from. So I want to transform it. I'm not a tabula rasa. I'm not like an empty board that you start writing from. There's a lot of writing that's already there. I want to transform it. I want it to be better writing. And that's the job that we have as activists. The problem with identity politics is when we use it to be determinative. When because you are a Latino, because you are a man, because you are a queer, then you must be this, or you must think this way. No, there's nothing determinative about it.
Mm-hmm. I think what you said about the problem being identity, not identities, I think that really captures the heart of it. It makes me think of the fact that in a real sense, nationalism might be the first form of identity politics. To say that we are all, and it's interesting that you bring up the genetic thing, because it's like, okay, what does that actually mean for Italian to be showing up in your genes when Italian as a nation is only 156 years old?
Correct. Yeah.
Like, this isn't a long history. These are things, at the end of the day, we're all people first and foremost on planet Earth. And I think it's important to be thinking about those privileges, where we deploy it, how we do it. And I think that gets back to what you were talking about yesterday of protective presence, which in a real sense is entirely about leveraging privilege, or trying to figure out how one can leverage privilege in a place where Jewish supremacy is dominant. Well, Sydney, I think this is a good spot as any to wrap up. Okay. I've really, really enjoyed chatting with you today. And again, we could chat for hours. And I really hope that we can find another time to have Zach join us and we couldn't do another
Inshallah.
follow-up on this, because I would love for this to be a two-part, because we haven't even talked about your current activism with JSWANA Bay, which is a really awesome group that I haven't been able to engage with enough here, as well as you've done stuff with Center for Jewish Nonviolence, Jewish Voice for Peace, a lot of different organizations, and I'd love to hear more about the work that you've done with that and the way this all comes together in the vision we have for the future. But just to wrap us up, can you tell our audience where they could find you and your work?
Next time when we speak, I can give you links and resources, which I think can be helpful. To me, the most important wrap up is just to remind people that everything that I said about me being a Zionist was true, but it's not true now. Just to say, I changed. I'm a better person. Every day we're building a new society and we're building a new culture. We have to do it purposefully. It's not just by accident. And we're doing it. And we don't see the full results of it just yet, but we're in it. And that's the exciting part.
Yeah. Thank you so much,
Okay,
Sydney. It's been a
take
pleasure
care.
to chat with you.
Bye.